The sun was sinking when they came for her. The dust of the village rose in thin spirals as the cattle shuffled, their bells clanging in hollow rhythm. 6 cows, ribs showing, tethered in a crooked line, her price. The men who had brought them laughed, their voices carrying above the murmurs of the crowd. Everyone watched, but no one moved. The girl's wrists were bound in front of her with a length of rough rope, the kind used to drag stubborn animals. She walked barefoot, the stones cutting her soles, yet she did not stumble. Behind her, her parents counted the cattle, their hands trembling as they stroked the hollow flanks. 1 cow coughed like an old man. Still they nodded. Still they agreed. Too few, someone whispered in the crowd. A daughter should be worth at least 10. Not this one, another muttered. Better cows than a mouth that eats. The words spread like dry grass catching fire, but none dared speak loudly. None dared meet her eyes. She was 16, small, thin, but with the strength of someone who had worked the field since childhood. Her voice had once been the sound of harvest. She sang while planting millet, her songs guiding the rhythm of hands and hoes. But now there was no song. Only the silence of betrayal, thicker than the dust. Her mother avoided her gaze, clutching at the hem of her wrapper. Her father lifted his chin, though his eyes were wet. They told themselves they had no choice, that hunger had left them with nothing but this bargain. 6 cows meant milk, meat, and trade. A daughter meant another mouth, another burden. The men who had come for her were warriors from across the river, their spears gleaming with oil, their laughter sharp as blades. They knew the bargain was unfair, but desperation left little room for fairness. They tugged the rope, pulling her forward. She did not cry out, did not plead. She let them drag her past the faces she had grown up with, faces that turned away pretending not to see. But she saw. She saw every one of them. A child slipped from his mother's grasp and stood at the edge of the path, wide-eyed. He did not speak, but in his silence was horror, and in his horror was truth. The girl met his gaze, and something in her face made him shiver. Because her eyes were not wet with tears. They were lit with fire. Each step she took away from the village, she carved a promise into her bones. She would return. Not as the daughter who could be sold for cattle, not as the girl whose worth was measured in weak hides and hollow ribs. She would return as something else, something the village could neither own nor silence. The villagers did not hear this vow, but they felt it. A heaviness in the air, a tremor in their bellies as though the earth itself shifted. Still none spoke. Still none moved. Her chains clinked against the rope as the men dragged her beyond the last hut, into the waiting dusk. The cattle followed, stumbling, their bells ringing out the price of betrayal. Her parents stood watching, hands still counting, lips pressed tight. Around them, whispers coiled like snakes. Too few. Too cheap. Too late. The girl looked back only once, her eyes burning hotter than the setting sun. The dust swallowed her, but her gaze lingered, etched into every witness like a wound that would never close. They thought they had rid themselves of a burden. They thought they had bought peace. But what they had bought was ruin, and what they had sold was far greater than a daughter. They thought they sold her silence. They sold their doom. The chieftain's compound was a world of shadows and noise, where the crack of whips mingled with the thud of drums. She arrived there in chains, dragged past a towering gate of carved wood and iron nails. Beyond it lay huts in neat rows, smoke rising from cooking fires, and warriors sharpening their spears while laughter broke from their throats like thunder. It was not a place for kindness. It was a place where power was law, and her body had been sold into it. The chieftain himself was a man of enormous girth, his chest adorned with necklaces of teeth and beads, his eyes small and sharp as beads of obsidian. He looked her over as one might a goat at market. Too thin, he muttered, then spat into the dust. Feed her when I say. Beat her when I say. She will learn her place. And so she did, though not in the way he imagined. Her first weeks were agony. She slept on cold earth, her wrists raw from the rope that never left them, and her stomach gnawed at itself from hunger. If she moved too slowly, the lash came. If she faltered in her tasks, carrying water, grinding grain, scrubbing the chieftain's robes, pain followed swiftly. Her body grew bruised, her back a map of welts. Yet through it all, her eyes stayed sharp, her mind sharper still. She watched, she listened, and she remembered. The compound was filled with others like her. Servants, captives, wives taken as spoils. Most had been broken long ago. They bent their backs and lowered their gazes, fearing even the sound of their own voices. But she, though beaten and starved, did not let her spirit hollow. She whispered songs under her breath when the work was hardest, old harvest tunes she once sang in the fields. Her voice was quiet, but it carried like warmth in cold air. Slowly, others drew near her. There was a younger girl, no more than 12, whose hands were always bleeding from scrubbing pots. She clung to the older girl's side, listening to her hums, watching her strength. Once, when the child wept after a beating, the girl pressed a piece of stale bread into her palm. "Eat," she said. "The day will come when we eat better than kings." From then on, the child looked at her not as another servant, but as a promise. There was also a guard, tall and scarred, whose spear was always at his side. He never spoke much, but his eyes lingered on her differently. Once, when she stumbled beneath a heavy jar of water and nearly fell, he caught her arm instead of letting her crash to the ground. He muttered, almost angrily, "Stand. Do not give them the satisfaction." She knew then that pity lived beneath his armor, though he dared not show it openly. In the nights when he patrolled near her hut, he sometimes paused as if listening to the faint strains of her hidden songs. Through these small threads she began to weave something larger. She learned which warriors were quick to anger, which ones drank too much and slept deeply. She noticed where the keys to the storehouse were kept, how the walls of the compound were weakest where the earth had crumbled. She memorized the paths of the guards, the time the drums called them to feast, the hours when the compound was most vulnerable. Pain taught her patience. Hunger taught her cunning. Loneliness taught her how to reach others in silence. Every blow she suffered hardened her resolve. Every lash across her back etched a new vow. She would not remain a shadow forever. She would not die nameless in this place. The younger girl whispered to her one night, "Why do you smile when they beat you?" She answered, "Because pain does not last. But what I learn while they hurt me, that lasts forever." The child frowned, not fully understanding. But she held tighter to the girl's hand that night, and in that touch was faith. The chieftain continued to sneer at her, blind to the ember he had brought into his house. He saw only a girl broken to his will. He did not see the fire behind her lowered gaze, the quiet rebellion in every breath she still dared to draw. Years passed. She grew taller, her shoulders strong from endless labor, her voice deeper with songs that carried both sorrow and defiance. Her chains remained, but they no longer dragged her down. They became ornaments she carried with grace, reminders of who she had been and what she would one day rise above. The guards mocked her, calling her the chained one, yet their mockery fed her resolve. If chains were her burden, she would turn them into symbols. If they thought her powerless, she would gather power where they never looked, among the weak, the forgotten, the invisible. And when she walked through the compound, barefoot in the dust, bruises dark upon her arms, there was something regal in the way she held herself. She carried her pain not like a victim, but like a crown. Every chain they placed upon her, she learned to carry like a crown. The festival came with the sound of drums that shook the ground like thunder. Fires blazed high in the compound, shadows leaping across the faces of warriors who feasted on meat and drank from gourds of palm wine. The air smelled of smoke and grease, of sweat and spilled beer. Every year, the chieftain threw such a celebration, a display of his wealth and power. Every year the people danced, laughed, and praised his name. But this year the festival brought her humiliation. At the height of the feast, when the drums pounded hardest and the warriors' laughter grew loudest, the chieftain ordered her to be dragged from the servants' quarters. She was shoved into the circle of firelight, her wrists bound, her body thin from years of labor. The warriors roared with amusement. "This one," the chieftain shouted, his voice booming like a war horn. "This girl was bought for 6 cows, 6 starved cows. And yet she thinks herself too proud to bow, too proud to weep." The men jeered, some tossing bones at her feet, others spitting into the dust. The chieftain circled her like a lion circling prey. "Dance," he barked. "Dance for your master, girl." She stood tall despite the rope that bound her wrists. "I will not," she said, her voice steady. The crowd erupted with laughter. A whip cracked across her back, tearing her flesh. She staggered but did not fall. Another lash came and another. Still she did not kneel. "Make her crawl," someone shouted. "Make her beg." And so they forced her to her knees, shoving her face into the dirt as the warriors howled with delight. They paraded her like a beast, dragging her by the rope from one end of the circle to the other, mocking her with chants, their laughter rising above the drums. Her humiliation was complete, or so they thought. But while her body bent under their cruelty, something inside her did not break. Something hardened instead. She felt it rising, steady as the tide, unyielding as stone. She looked up through strands of hair matted with blood and sweat, and in her eyes burned not defeat but defiance. She would never belong to them. She would never belong to anyone again. That night, after the fires died down and the drunken warriors lay sprawled in the dust, she sat in the shadows of the servants' quarters, her body trembling from pain. The younger girl who always followed her whispered, "Why didn't you cry? Why didn't you beg them to stop?" She answered softly, her lips cracked but her voice firm, "Because tears are what they wanted. I will never give them what they want." The younger girl's eyes widened, and in that moment, a seed was planted, hope where none had been before. The guard with the scarred face passed by her hut later, his steps slow, his eyes lingering. He did not speak, but his silence was heavy with respect. For the first time he bowed his head slightly as he walked on. And in the shadows, whispers began. At first they were small. Servants huddled around the fire at night, speaking of how she had refused to break, how she had stared down the chief himself. Others remembered how she shared scraps of food, how her songs gave them strength in their hardest moments. They began to see her not as another captive, but as something more. She began to move carefully, planting words like seeds. "Do you want to live like this forever?" she would ask in hushed tones while grinding grain. "Do you not deserve better?" She never spoke of rebellion outright, not yet. But her questions lingered in their hearts, growing louder with every insult, every strike of the whip. Soon, loyalty formed around her in secret, as natural as roots growing beneath the soil. A hand slipping her an extra piece of bread. A servant deliberately spilling wine to distract a guard from her bruises. Eyes turning to her for guidance without a word spoken. And one night, when the chieftain's drums boomed across the compound, she laughed. It was not a laugh of joy nor of despair. It was sharp, cold, and certain. It cut through the noise like a blade. Those who heard it shivered, for it sounded less like the laughter of a beaten girl and more like the laughter of someone who already knew the end of the story. The younger girl whispered, frightened, "Why are you laughing?" She leaned close, her smile hidden in the shadows. "Because one day soon their drums will beat for me." And though the feast had ended, though the fire had burned to embers, her war had begun. The night they celebrated her shame was the night she began her war. The night she chose to strike was moonless, the sky heavy with clouds that smothered the stars. The compound lay in uneasy silence, broken only by the snores of drunken warriors and the occasional bark of a restless dog. She had waited for such a night, watched the patterns, memorized the guards' paths, counted the moments when the world seemed to sleep deepest. She moved like smoke through the servants' quarters, her steps soft against the packed earth. A handful of others stirred awake as she passed. Their eyes widened, but she pressed a finger to her lips, her gaze steady, commanding silence. She stopped by the corner where the younger girl slept, curled tight like a bird. Gently she shook her awake. "Come," she whispered. "Tonight we breathe free air." The girl blinked, confusion giving way to trembling hope. Together they crept toward the pen where captives were locked, a crude wooden enclosure bound with rope and iron nails. The guard nearby had slumped against the fence, his gourd of wine tipped over, his mouth slack with drunkenness. She knelt in the dirt, her hands working quickly at the knots she had studied 100 times before. The rope frayed, loosened, and finally gave way. One by one the captives slipped out, their breath ragged with disbelief. She touched each of them lightly on the arm as they passed, a silent command to move quickly, to make no sound. Her heart pounded, but her face was calm. She had imagined this moment so many times that it felt less like a risk and more like destiny. Once the last captive slipped into the night, she turned her eyes toward the storehouse. The chieftain's pride, stacked high with sacks of millet and jars of grain, stood fat and unguarded. All the wealth of the compound lay in those walls, food that meant power, food that meant control. She felt the anger rise in her chest, sharp as fire. It was not enough to free the captives. The chieftain had to bleed. She snatched a torch from a smoldering fire pit, shielding its glow with her body as she crept to the storehouse. The dried thatch of the roof caught quickly, flames licking upward with hungry tongues. She stepped back, watching the blaze climb higher, the heat pressing against her skin. It lit the night with a furious orange glow, sparks flying into the darkness. The first shout came moments later. Then another. Warriors scrambled to their feet, spears clattering, shouts echoing across the compound. They rushed toward the storehouse, their eyes wide with panic. Some tried to throw water, but the fire had already grown too fierce, devouring grain sacks and collapsing wooden beams. The air filled with the acrid scent of burning food, the lifeblood of the chieftain's power. Amid the chaos, she slipped back into the shadows, her face illuminated by the blaze only for a heartbeat before she vanished again. She watched from the cover of a low wall as the warriors shouted, stumbling in confusion, their drunkenness slowing their efforts. The chieftain himself emerged, his great body wrapped in a cloak, his voice hoarse with rage. "Find who did this," he bellowed, his eyes wild. "Bring them to me." But no one knew. No one saw her. The freed captives were already gone, melting into the night like spirits. The younger girl clung to her side in the dark, her small body trembling with fear and awe. "They'll kill us if they find out," she whispered. "They won't," the girl answered, her voice like stone. "Not yet. They don't even know where to look." The fire raged until the roof collapsed, sparks showering the compound. Warriors coughed and choked on smoke, their faces smeared with ash in panic. The chieftain roared curses into the night, but his power had been struck at its heart. Hunger would soon follow, and with it, weakness. By dawn, nothing remained of the storehouse but blackened timbers and ash. The chieftain stood before the ruin, his fists clenched, his face streaked with soot. Around him, his warriors muttered, unease creeping into their voices. Fear had entered the compound, not of enemies beyond the river but of someone within. It was then that one of the guards noticed something half buried in the ash. He bent down, pulling free a scrap of cloth. The chieftain's banner, once red with pride, now blackened and torn. And smeared across it, clear even in the morning light, was the print of a hand pressed into the soot. The guard held it up, his face pale. The chieftain's eyes narrowed. For the first time, he looked around not with the arrogance of a man unchallenged, but with the suspicion of a man haunted. The handprint was small, too small for a warrior. It could have belonged to a servant. To a girl. And from that moment, the chieftain began to fear shadows. The uprising began not with the clash of spears, but with a whisper. The girl, no longer meek, no longer merely a servant, moved through the huts at night, her steps light as a breeze, her voice steady as river stone. She spoke of fire, of freedom, of the moment when chains would snap like brittle twigs. Her words were sharper than any blade. They cut through fear, stitched together hope, and bound the broken into something stronger. The slaves listened. They had suffered too long, whipped until their backs tore, starved until their bellies ached, forced to bow until their necks stiffened. But no one had ever spoken to them as she did. She did not beg. She did not plead. She promised. "Every chain is a weapon," she said one night, holding up the iron cuff still locked around her wrist. "Every whip is a rope to strangle its master. We are not weak. We are many." And the night remembers. They believed her because she believed herself. The first strike came swift and silent. A drunken overseer disappeared into the darkness, dragged behind the huts by hands that no longer trembled. His spear and whip were divided among the captives. Then another guard fell. And another. Within days, the shadows seemed to close in around the chieftain's warriors, who began to mutter about spirits in the night. But it was not spirits. It was her. When the chieftain finally called his men to stand guard at every corner, she shifted her tactics. She led her people not with muscle but with mind. She taught them to watch, to wait, to strike not where the enemy was strong but where he was weak. They used the huts as cover, the forests as traps, the river as a shield. Warriors found themselves lost in their own land, ambushed by hands that once carried water and firewood. It was the first time in memory that slaves had not cowered when warriors shouted. It was the first time that warriors had felt hunted. The younger girl, once a frightened shadow clinging to her, became her closest messenger, darting between groups with quick feet and sharp eyes. The guard who had once pitted her now bent his knee willingly, teaching her followers the tricks of a soldier's hand, but bowing always to her command. Her name spread. Not her true name, for that had been stripped away with her freedom, but the one they whispered in fear and awe, the slave queen. One night, the chieftain ordered a festival of blood to remind all who ruled. He dragged a captured boy before the fire, lifted his spear and declared, "This is the fate of rebels." But before he could strike, a cry split the night, not of fear but of defiance. She stepped into the circle, her chains clinking like ornaments. Her eyes burned in the firelight, her voice steady. "No more." The crowd froze. Slaves, warriors, even the chieftain's wives, all stared at her. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then from the shadows dozens of figures emerged, slaves armed with stolen spears, knives and farm tools sharpened into weapons. They surrounded the circle, their faces hard, their bodies trembling not with fear but with the force of decision. The chieftain laughed, thinking it a fool's stand. He raised his spear to strike her down. But before the blade could fall, 3 of his own guards turned their weapons against him. The betrayal cracked the air like thunder. Chaos followed. Screams, shouts, blood. But it was not chaos for her. She had planned this moment for weeks, every movement laid out in her mind like a map. Her people struck where she pointed, retreated when she raised her hand, pressed forward when her voice rose above the din. The slaves fought not like warriors but like water, slipping, surrounding, drowning. By dawn the compound lay broken. Fires smoldered where huts had burned. Warriors lay bound, their weapons stripped away. The chieftain himself knelt in the dirt, his face swollen, his cloak torn, his breath ragged. He looked up at her with hatred and fear. She did not strike him down immediately. She made him kneel before those he had once owned. One by one the slaves spat upon him, struck him, broke the silence he had forced upon them. When at last he was dragged away into the forest, never to return, the air itself seemed to lighten, as if the land had been waiting for his fall. In the center of the compound the people gathered. They had no crown to place upon her head, no throne to seat her upon. But when she lifted her hand, stained with the blood of battle, men and women dropped to their knees without command. She wore no jewels, no golden ornaments. Her chains still clinked at her wrists. Yet when she stood among them, shoulders straight, eyes unyielding, she was more radiant than any queen born in luxury. The younger girl pressed a garland of wildflowers into her hand. Not a crown of gold but a crown all the same. She placed it upon her head, the petals trembling in the dawn breeze. Her voice rang out, firm as iron, "We were slaves. We are slaves no more. We are a people. And together we will not bow again." A roar rose up, fierce and trembling, filling the air with the sound of something being reborn. The compound that had been a prison was now a fortress. The people who had been broken were now soldiers. And she, their queen, ruled not with fear but with a fire that could not be quenched. The Queen of Chains did not sit idle once her first enemy fell. The ashes of the chieftain's compound had barely cooled when she marched her people beyond the borders, a river of freed hands carrying spears, knives and fire. The first neighboring village had laughed at the thought of slaves turned warriors. Their warriors jeered when they saw the ragged army approach, their spears gleaming in the sun. But when the queen raised her hand, silence fell. Her people surged forward not like soldiers but like a storm. They fought with the fury of 1,000 stolen lives, and when the dust cleared, the village stood stripped of power. Those who had once been slaves were set free. The chains were shattered and piled high in the center of the square, melted in fire until they formed a twisted monument. "No one wears these again," the queen declared, her voice echoing across the broken huts. And no one dared. Word spread quickly. She was no longer simply a rebel or a runaway. She was the Queen of Chains, a name whispered with awe and terror. To the enslaved she was deliverance. To rulers she was death walking. With each conquest her army grew. The freed did not scatter, they joined her. Farmers left behind barren fields, smiths reforged their shackles into blades, children carried messages along secret paths. Her people called her Mother of the Unbroken, but her enemies called her the Ash Queen, for every village that resisted her was left smoking, its warriors buried in blackened soil. Her justice was brutal but it was never blind. Those who raised chains against the innocent were slaughtered. Betrayers were staked in the open, their bones left as warnings. Yet when she freed the oppressed, she fed them, clothed them and gave them purpose. She did not build a palace for herself, she built a fortress for all, stone walls carved with symbols of broken shackles. And still, beneath her iron will, her heart ached. Each night, when the fires burned low and her army slept, she remembered the day she had been sold. The faces of her parents counting cows, the villagers turning away in silence, the shame she had swallowed as chains bit into her wrists. It haunted her more than the screams of her enemies. For every village she conquered, she asked the same question, "How much is a daughter worth?" The question broke people before the blade did. Some wept and begged, swearing they had never sold their blood. Others stammered, fearing that the queen herself had come to expose their sins. But she always waited for the answer, her voice calm, her gaze unflinching. "More than cows," one trembling elder once whispered, bowing before her. She let that village live, its chains destroyed, its people spared. But when another chief sneered and spat, saying, "A daughter is worth nothing if she is born weak," she burned his compound to the ground. The flames lit the night sky, and her army sang the songs of the freed. Her enemies began to whisper that she was not human at all, but a spirit of vengeance wearing a woman's skin. They told their children to never speak of cows, lest her shadow fall upon their hearth. Some fled before her army arrived, abandoning their fields and homes to rot. Others fortified their walls, praying their chains would hold her wrath back. But chains no longer bound her. Chains followed her. Her soldiers carried them into battle, not as shackles but as weapons. Linked together, they dragged down enemy riders. Twined around arms, they turned into shields. Whirled through the air, they cracked against skulls. What had once been her prison was now her banner. She was the queen of chains, and no wall, no gate, no army could hold against her. Yet power did not come without weight. Her people adored her, but they also feared her. She had freed them, but she ruled with iron. A whisper of betrayal, and someone vanished into the night. A hint of cowardice, and they were chained before the crowd until they swore loyalty. Her rule was harsh because she had learned that mercy in the hands of the cruel was weakness. Still, the girl inside, the one who had once sung to the fields, the one who had been sold for cows, whispered questions that no victory could silence. Would her parents recognize her now, draped in ash and iron? Would they fear her more than they ever loved her? Did they regret the moment they traded her life for cattle? And if she stood before them, crownless yet more queen than any ruler, would they kneel, or would they sell her again? Her victories piled higher. Villages fell. Chiefs knelt. Chains shattered. Her name spread beyond borders, reaching the ears of kings across rivers and deserts. Some sent spies to watch her rise. Others prepared armies to meet her fire. But still she marched, and with each step the world shook a little more. The legend grew. Some called her savior, others conqueror. Some called her a monster born of betrayal, others a mother born of justice. But all agreed on one thing: wherever she walked, the ground remembered chains. And in the quiet moments, when the stars burned above her camps and the wind carried the scent of ash, she whispered her promise to the night. They thought they bought my silence. I will make the world hear me. The march home was unlike any other. By then the Queen of Chains had carved her name across valleys and hills, through smoke and blood. Her banners, black cloth marked with a white shackle split in two, were carried at the head of her army. Wherever they rose, silence fell. Whole villages abandoned their homes rather than face her wrath. Chiefs who once laughed at rumors of a slave girl leading rebels now offered their spears without a fight. But this march was different. It was not conquest that drove her, nor glory, nor gold. It was memory. The village that had sold her, the place where her life had been broken and chained, waited at the end of the road. Her army stretched behind her like a river of iron, thousands strong. The sound of their march was thunder upon the earth. Dust rose in waves, and scouts raced ahead to spread the word. The queen was coming. When the first huts of her village appeared on the horizon, her heart tightened, not with nostalgia but with fury. The fields she had once tended were withered. The once proud granaries leaned and sagged. The village that had betrayed her for cows now looked frail, hollow, trembling under the weight of its sins. They had prospered once, fattened by their bargains and cruelty. Now they shook at her banners. Her soldiers set camp at the edge of the fields. No one dared resist. Old men and women peeked from doorways, eyes wide with fear, while children clung to their mothers' skirts, silent and confused. The queen gave no order to attack. She wanted the village to wait, to taste the dread that had once filled her bones. That night she did not sleep. She stood at the edge of the fields where she had once sung to the soil, her chains clinking in the wind. The land remembered her voice. She could almost hear the echo of the girl she had been, barefoot and laughing. But that girl was gone, swallowed by fire and iron. At dawn she entered the village. Her people marched behind her in perfect silence, their armor gleaming, their weapons sharp. The villagers had gathered in the square, their faces pale, their bodies bent like reeds in the wind. Some fell to their knees at once, pressing their foreheads to the ground. Others wept openly. And there, at the center of the crowd, stood her family. Her father was bent with age, his back hunched, his eyes clouded but not blind. Her mother was frail, her hair white, her hands trembling as they clutched the shawl at her shoulders. Beside them stood her brother, no longer the innocent boy she had once known, but a man with lines of worry carved into his face. They did not run to her. They did not speak her name. They only stood there, waiting for the storm they had sown. She stopped before them, her army forming a ring around the square. The silence was suffocating. Her chains, looped across her chest like ornaments, gleamed in the morning light. Her father opened his mouth but no words came. Her mother was the first to speak, her voice cracked with age and regret. "We only wanted to live," she whispered, tears slipping down her wrinkled cheeks. "The hunger was great. The cows meant survival. We thought you were strong enough to endure." The queen's eyes burned like embers. She took a step closer, her voice low, steady, sharp enough to cut the air. "You sold me," she said. Not for bread. Not for water. 4 cows. Her brother tried to speak then, his hands trembling. We were children. I was powerless. Please. But her gaze silenced him. Around them, the villagers bowed lower, some wailing, some murmuring prayers. They all knew what was coming, though none dared name it. The queen lifted her hand and the square seemed to freeze. Her voice rang out, cold as iron. You gave me away like I was nothing. You traded my life for cattle. You carved chains into my skin with your silence. Do you see me now? Do you know what you made? Her mother's sobs shook her frail body. Forgive us. We were afraid. The queen's lips curled into something that was not a smile. And now you will remember me in death. Her soldiers stepped forward at her command. The villagers screamed as warriors dragged her family to their knees in the center of the square. Her father tried to fight, but age had stolen his strength. Her brother wept openly, begging, his words tripping over one another. Her mother did not struggle. She only lifted her face to her daughter, eyes wet, and whispered a prayer to no God strong enough to intervene. The Queen of Chains did not draw her blade. She did not need to. Her soldiers obeyed and the ground was painted red. The crowd howled. Some tried to flee but the Queen's banners blocked every path. Others clutched their heads, unable to watch. Yet none raised a hand to stop her. When it was done, silence returned to the square. Her family's blood soaked into the earth, the same earth where she had once played, once sung, once been sold. The Queen stood over their bodies, her voice carrying like thunder. This is the price of betrayal. This is the cost of a daughter's life. Her army roared in answer, the sound shaking the sky. The villagers cowered, knowing they had birthed their own destruction. But inside her the victory felt hollow. She had dreamed of this day, of the moment when those who betrayed her would kneel before her power. Yet as she looked down at the lifeless forms of her parents, her brother, she felt no triumph. Only emptiness. Still she did not falter. She turned her back on them, raising her hand high. Burn it, she commanded. Her soldiers moved without hesitation. Flames leapt from hut to hut, consuming the village that had once consumed her. Smoke billowed into the sky, thick and choking, while the wails of the guilty blended with the crackle of fire. By nightfall, nothing remained but ash. The Queen stood at the edge of the ruin, her army at her back. She had returned not as the barefoot girl they sold, but as the ruler of chains and fire. And the village that betrayed her was no more. Yet the question remained, echoing in her chest like a hollow drum. Was a daughter's worth truly paid in blood? The square was alive with fear. Drums thundered as her army dragged the last of the villagers into the center. Smoke from burning torches curled into the dusk sky, painting the air red and black. The Queen of Chains stood tall, her shadow stretched long across the dirt, her armor glinting like molten iron. Around her, warriors pounded their spears against the earth, a rhythm of judgment, of finality. And then came the cows. Dozens of them, sleek and heavy, their hides gleaming under the torchlight. Their bells clanged harshly, a sound that should have meant prosperity but now rang like the tolling of a funeral drum. The animals snorted and stamped, confused by the smoke, the crowd, the tension in the air. Driven by her soldiers, they were her cruelest weapon, the living reminder of what had been traded for her life. The villagers gasped when they saw them. Some whispered prayers, others wept openly. They knew why the animals were there. They knew whose sins had returned, heavier than hooves. Her family was dragged to the front of the square, her father trembling, her brother's face pale as ash, her mother clinging to her shawl as though it could shield her from what was coming. They were forced to kneel on the dirt, their bodies frail beneath the weight of hundreds of watching eyes. The Queen's voice rang out like a blade drawn across stone. Years ago you sold me for these. She gestured to the herd, the bells clanging in eerie unison. Cows, cattle, meat and hide. You gave away your daughter for beasts. You thought no one would remember. But the earth does not forget. And neither do I. Her words struck the crowd like thunder. The villagers shifted uneasily, their faces pale in the firelight. Some looked away in shame, others in terror, but none dared speak. The Queen stepped forward, her chains clinking with every move. She stared down at her kneeling family, her gaze burning like coals. Tonight you will answer. Not to me alone. To the people who watched, to the children who learned betrayal from your hands, to the ancestors who looked down upon this square. She raised her hand and the herd shifted. Warriors prodded the animals closer, their hooves clattering against the packed earth. The bells clanged louder, each note slicing through the silence. The cows snorted, restless, their sheer weight a looming storm above the kneeling family. Her mother began to sob, clutching at the air as though reaching for a daughter long gone. "We only wanted to live," she whispered again, her voice broken, swallowed by the noise. The queen's expression did not soften. Her voice cut through the cries, steady and cold. "Then live. If you can." She raised her hand higher. The warriors pulled the herd forward. The ground shook as the cows drew nearer, their bells clanging like the beating of war drums. Her father's eyes widened. Her brother cried out in panic, crawling against his bonds. The queen spoke again, her words sharp as iron. "You have two choices. Be trampled beneath the weight of what you chose over me, or beg for my forgiveness before those you betrayed." The square held its breath. Her father was the first to break. Pride, once carved deep into his bones, shattered like dry clay. He bowed until his face touched the dirt, his voice cracking as he begged, "Forgive us. Daughter, forgive us. We were blind. We were weak." Her brother followed, tears streaking his face as he choked on his pleas. "I was a child. I could not stop them. Forgive me, sister, please." Only her mother lifted her head, her eyes brimming with both sorrow and defiance. "You are my blood," she whispered. "Even if you kill me, I will not beg. I gave you life. I have nothing left to give." The queen's face was unreadable. For a moment, the silence stretched, broken only by the clang of bells and the restless stamping of hooves. Then, slowly she lowered her hand. The herd stopped. Her people murmured, the tension thick as smoke. Some had wanted blood, others mercy. But the queen gave them something different, a lesson carved in terror. She turned, her chains clattering as she faced the crowd. Her voice rose above the noise, fierce and unyielding. "Every village will know this truth. A daughter is worth more than cows. A life cannot be sold. A child cannot be bargained. Those who try will find the price is their own blood." The villagers trembled. None dared defy her. And then from the edges of the crowd, a chant began. Soft at first, then louder. Her name. Not theirs. Not the family's. Hers. Queen of Chains. Queen of Chains. Queen of Chains. The chant grew until it shook the square, until even the cows stilled as though listening. Her family bowed their heads lower, buried in shame as the name of the daughter they had betrayed rose like thunder over the village. She looked down at them one final time, her gaze cold as stone. "You are judged," she said simply. "By your own choices. By your people. By me." She turned and walked away, her chains ringing like victory bells. Behind her, the villagers continued their chant, the name of the queen echoing into the night. The village burned behind her, flames licking the night sky, turning the horizon into a wall of fire. Her soldiers marched in silence, their footsteps steady, their voices hushed. They had won again as they always did. But there was no singing tonight, no laughter around the campfires. The people had seen their queen's wrath, and though they followed her, they feared her too. The Queen of Chains rode at the head of her army, her face unreadable, her crown of iron gleaming dully in the firelight. She did not look back at the ruins. She did not need to. The smell of smoke clung to her skin, the screams still echoed in her bones. She had taken her revenge. She had given judgment. Yet inside, the hollow ache only deepened. In every village they passed, people knelt before her, pressing their foreheads to the dust. Mothers pulled their children close, whispering warnings. "Do not look at her. She is the Queen of Chains." Chiefs offered cattle, grain, and their own sons as tribute, terrified of what she might demand if denied. Her banners were enough to send strong men trembling, her name enough to silence entire markets. She was no longer just a conqueror. She was a shadow cast over the world, feared more than famine, more than war, more than death itself. And yet, when she sat upon her throne, built not of gold but of blackened wood and iron chains, she sat alone. The great hall was filled with warriors, advisors, and those desperate to please her. They bowed low, their voices trembling when they spoke her name. But none dared to look into her eyes. None dared to speak freely. None dared to sit beside her. She was surrounded by loyalty, but it was loyalty born of fear. At night, when the torches guttered and silence wrapped itself around her halls, she heard them. Not the voices of her people. Not the cries of her enemies. The chains. Rattling in the corners of her chamber. Clinking in the dark. Mocking her. She would wake with her hands clutching at her wrists, half expecting to feel the bite of iron there. She would reach for her crown and find it heavy, heavier than the chains had ever been. For years she had dreamed of freedom, of breaking her bonds, of seeing the sky without the weight of iron. She had broken her chains, yes. She had melted them into weapons, worn them like jewels, built her throne upon them. But still she carried them. Still, they whispered to her in her sleep. She had thought vengeance would set her free. Instead, it had built another prison. One evening, as the sun bled red over the horizon, she stood on the balcony of her hall, looking down at the city that had grown around her. The streets were wide, the walls strong, the markets bustling. Her people were no longer slaves. They walked free. Yet when they passed her soldiers, they bowed too low, too long, their faces pale with fear. Freedom, she realized, had come at a price. And the price was her. She touched the crown upon her head, its iron edges biting into her brow. She had been a daughter sold for cows. A girl in chains. A slave turned queen. But now she was something else entirely, something the world had created out of fear and blood. The Queen of Chains. The name echoed through the hall as her advisors spoke it, echoed through the markets as her people whispered it, echoed through the nightmares that left her waking in sweat. And still she could not escape the sound of the rattling. The years passed, then decades, then centuries. The earth swallowed the ruins of the villages she burned, and grass grew over the bones of those who had knelt before her. Time softened the sharp edges of memory, but her name did not fade. It lingered, heavier than iron, carried on the tongues of those who told stories around firelight. Children whispered her tale in the dark, daring one another to say her name 3 times, as though she might rise again from the shadows. They shivered, imagining chains rattling in the night, the sound of hooves clanging through empty squares. For them she was more than a queen, she was a warning. Among elders, her story was told with slower voices, careful and reverent. They spoke of the girl who had been betrayed, sold for cows, treated as less than livestock. They spoke of the woman who rose from those chains, who burned her shame into glory. They debated what she truly was, a savior who freed the enslaved, or a tyrant who ruled with fire and blood. Some called her cruel, others called her just. None dared to call her forgotten. Her legend traveled farther than her armies ever did. Beyond the mountains, across the rivers, to lands that had never seen her banners. Merchants told her tale in busy markets. Warriors invoked her name before battle. Even kings sat uneasy when her story reached their ears, shifting on their thrones as if her shadow might reach them too. And so she lived on long after her bones turned to dust. For some, she was a lesson, that no chain could hold a spirit forever. For others, she was a curse, proof that vengeance leaves only ashes. But for all, she was a queen unlike any other. Not crowned by birthright. Not raised by fortune. Forged instead by betrayal, chains and fire. Sometimes in villages where the wind whistled through abandoned kraals, people swore they could hear laughter carried across the fields, a laughter sharp as drums, strong as iron. Mothers hushed their children quickly, warning them not to mock the sound. "It is her," they whispered. "The queen who was sold." Her name was never spoken without weight. Even when softened into lullabies, even when woven into songs, it carried both awe and fear. She was a daughter, a slave, a rebel, a conqueror. She was every wound the world had dealt, and every wound repaid. And in the end her story always ended the same way.